On today's program, I interview Matthew Stein. Matt Stein is a design engineer, green builder, author of two best-selling books, When Disaster Strikes, a comprehensive guide to emergency planning and crisis survival, and When Technology Fails, a manual for self-reliance, sustainability, and surviving the long emergency. Stein is a National Merit Scholar, a graduate of MIT, where he majored in mechanical engineering, and recipient of the Straight T Award, MIT's highest athletic honor. To learn more about Matthew Stein, visit whentechfails.com. Matt, now talk about technology failing. We experienced that just last night. We were going to do this show yesterday, but your power went out. I thought, what's going on? Was there an EMP?
No, we've been having some problems locally because we had some major storms. But I thought, what the hell's going on yesterday? Because there was no storm, blue skies. The storm ended, the blizzard ended a day before. But just last week we'd had a mudslide a couple weeks ago that took out the trunk line coming into Tahoe from the main part of California, coming in from the west, and then last week they had a tree fell in the blizzard and it knocked down the trunk line coming up from Reno. So the entire Tahoe Basin was knocked out for about 17 hours. And then a transformer blew. With all of that going on, some local transformer blew. And so they had guys working around the clock to get power back up. And we were out of power for, almost 24 hours, and it was cold outside. It's probably 10 degrees at night. And we had deep snow. We've gotten 10 miles away from here. We've had almost 25 feet of snow in the last month. So, and we probably had 10 feet at my house. So it's been a big snowy month here in California. The drought is officially over.
So we're talking about EMPs today. What exactly is an EMP? Because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings as to what it is.
Sure. An EMP is an electromagnetic pulse, and it's generated typically by a nuclear device that's been detonated way above the surface of the Earth. So pretty much the higher you can detonate the device, the more destructive the energy will be to electronics because it's a line of sight type thing. So if you've got a little teeny Scud missile and a small tactical nuke and you blow it off 5 miles above the Earth, you'll probably have like a 200-mile zone where electronics is the critical electronics. Not all electronics is destroyed, but the critical stuff. I'll get into that in a minute. If you've got a really big missile like the Pakistanis have, like North Korea has, like India has, like China and Russia certainly have, and you blow off a nuclear device, say a couple hundred miles over the Earth, then you're looking at a zone more like a 2,000-mile circle or a 3,000-mile circle. So basically, if you get up 300 or 400 miles above the surface of the Earth when you blow one off, you could knock out the critical electronics in over most of North America, and that would be really serious. So there's a common misconception that in an EMP attack. So an EMP is something that would be launched by a foreign state. Like say China, something happened, things degraded between America and China, and they've got super EMP weapons, and they decided that they were just going to do one blast that was going to take out America. That's one possibility. The more likely scenario is that the country that scares me the most is Pakistan, because Pakistan is supposedly a friend of the United States, but it's infiltrated at all levels of government and military with fundamentalist Islamists. And they have the technology. Pakistan is poised to become the number 3 nuclear power in the world, behind the United States and Russia. They're going to have more nuclear weapons than China, more than France, more than England, and only be behind the United States and Russia. And they have the technology to deliver a kill shot with an EMP blast. Now, the government themselves would probably not do it. What scares me is because of the infiltration of the military and the government, that somebody might collude to get a device and the technology out of the country, say put it on a freighter, and off in the middle of the ocean, a missile goes off this freighter, goes over the United States, goes off, and boom, it's the end of the world as we know it for North America. And so now I'll explain why that happens. Now, the when the bomb goes off in suborbital space, or up there way above the surface of the planet, then what happens, these gamma rays go out and they interact with the upper atmosphere, and it causes an electromagnetic pulse, an electromagnetic effect. And what you have is you have three different effects from the EMP going off. You have an E1 effect, an E2, and an E3. So the E1 effect happens in nanoseconds. That's like a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a blink of an eye. It's basically an almost speed of light effect. And what it's like is on a cold winter's day, you rub your feet in a carpet in a cold winter's day, right? And you shocked somebody, ever like wander around and
Yeah, it's been a very cold winter here. I'm shocked.
Yeah.
I'm shocking myself all over the house.
Okay, right. And I remember in high school, or seventh grade, when kids like to do that, you'd rub your feet on the carpet and walk up behind somebody and hold your finger to their neck and watch them jump, out of their chair. That was a real fun thing to do. So an E1 effect is, imagine now like all your electronic gadgets, and you open them up and you rub your feet in the carpet and you put your fingers up to the chips and you hold them and you spark them and you say, gee, wonder what that did. Gee, I wonder what that did. And you spark all the chips and you wonder, how many of them survived. So that's sort of an E1 effect. Now, there's a falsehood that says that every single electronic device will fail. Well, it turns out that that's not really true. Your iPhone will probably survive the EMP effect. A little transistor radio that's sitting there and not plugged into anything will probably survive.
So you can communicate with people.
Yes and no. Everything that's networked together with wires, that's going to fry. Essentially all of the complex digital control systems that makes our world run, that are networked together, the digital control systems in our factories, the networked stuff that makes the internet work, all of the things like in our nuclear power plants that are networked together and linked together with wires, all that stuff's going to fry. So will every single chip in every single electronic device fail? No. But will enough chips in every complicated digital system fail that the entire system will collapse? Almost certainly. So you're talking about the destruction of all the stuff that makes our world go round within the zone that's affected by the nuclear device, by the EMP. So now there's an E2 effect. So the E1 effect happens in a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a blink of an eye. The E2 effect happens in like a fraction of a second, like a tenth of a second, a half a second, a quarter second, that kind of thing. And the E2 effect is like thousands to millions of lightning bolts striking within that same half second over the affected area. And and part of the problem there is we all have those cool surge protectors, protecting our computers and protecting our TVs and all that cool stuff. The surge protectors, however, unless they're rated with nanosecond reaction times and they're mil-spec type surge protectors, they're going to fail from the E1 effect. So then the E2 effect is like all these millions of lightning bolts striking over the affected zone within the same half second. So all these giant surges of power are going to be coming down the lines, and those surge protectors that we thought were protecting everything are going to be disabled by the E1 effect. And so all that stuff, the equipment that wasn't destroyed by the E1 effect, most of that that's plugged in will be destroyed by the E2 coming down the lines.
Do they have those surge protectors? Can you buy these better ones?
Yes, you can. They're special protectors, and I can look up the name. I'm spacing on it right now. There's a company in Carson City, Nevada, that makes the mil-spec surge protectors that have reaction times in nanoseconds that are proper for that. So you can, and
they'll protect your device in the case of an EMP.
They'll protect from the surge, but they won't protect from the E1 effect. So the E1 effect, basically, and we'll get into protection in a few minutes, because first we've got to get to the E3 effect and what that's going to do, and then we'll talk about the ramifications of all the cool stuff that's going to fry, and then we can talk about how to protect your stuff. How's that sound? So the E3 effect now comes along from the space of about 1 or 2 seconds and can last for 30, 40 seconds to 10 to 20 minutes. And the E3 effect is like a long, slow burn. And that's what goes basically, we've got about, in the United States, we've got about 250,000 miles of high voltage lines. Like you see those towers with the lines where their towers are like a mile apart and they're way up off the ground. And those lines are carrying power from one end to another to distribute power across the grid in North America. And they're called extra high voltage. So they're running in anywhere from 250,000 volts to well over 1 million volts. And so at one end, they've got this giant transformer that steps up the power, and then it goes miles and miles and miles. And then at the other end, they've got giant transformer that steps down the power, because your local grid can't work in 250,000 to 1.5 million volts. So, they've got to bring the power back down. Now, what happens then is the E3 effect is you get this big, it induces a giant scrambled wave in these huge power lines, and those go down and they enter the transformers at both ends. Now, these power lines are working in megawatts of power, like huge amounts of power, like what's generated in a nuclear power plant or generated by a dam, Hoover Dam, that kind of thing, or coal power plant, like megawatts of power going down these lines. And the transformers are designed to handle huge amounts of power. But when this asynchronous, this totally out of phase blast of energy gets zapped into them from the E3 effect, it scrambles it, and it causes eddy currents inside these transformers, and they lose efficiency. And when a transformer that's running megawatts, that's normally super efficient, and they've got these giant air-cooled oil coolers on them that take the heat out and then distribute it to the air to keep the transformers from overfeeding. So all of a sudden, these things that are running at like 98%, 99.5% efficiency go down to like 70% efficiency. Then there's this megawatts going through, and all of a sudden they've lost efficiency, and so that's translated into extra heat, and they burn up. And people say, well, so what if a transformer burns up, right? They got more of these on hand, right? And they can just go to the store and put another transformer in. Well, these transformers that our grid is totally dependent on are tens of millions of dollars each. They're hundreds of tons each. They're custom designed and custom built for every single application. And there's a 3-year waiting list to get a single transformer made. Now, in 2003, I think, there was a big solar storm, which is similar but not the same as an EMP, and it caused the grid to fry 13 of these transformers, or 14 eventually failed in South Africa. And so what happened was the whole country operated on rolling blackouts, because for the next year, it took them a year to rush in transformers from all around the world to replace these 14 that went down. And so for a year, they were like minus 14 of these major transformers. So the only way they could keep the country running was by rationing power, that, certain days of the week, whole cities would be just blacked out for 7 or 8 hours. So, you saw what an inconvenience that was for us trying to do our broadcast last night when we were down for an hour and a half. Imagine going for a year where 3 or 4 days out of your work week, you'd have 6 or 7 hours of the day with no power. And every single backup generator in the country was scarfed up in the first hour after this major blackout. And then it took them months to get more backup generators, on boats and loaded into South Africa, basically as fast as they could bring them in, they'd sell out again. So imagine now, if we have a giant solar storm like we had in the last one, that size is 1921, before we had a big grid in the world, long before these extra high voltage transformers were invented, like in the 70s, so they didn't even exist. And so we have this major Achilles heel in our grid power system now that didn't exist the last time an extreme solar event happened in the United States. We had one in 1921, the Great Geomagnetic Storm in 1921, and then they had the granddaddy of all solar storms in modern history. It was the 1859 Carrington event. So scientists have figured out that we have these massive solar storms, an average of once every 8 decades or so. It's been 9.5 decades since the last one, and it was only 6 decades before that to the Carrington event. So on a statistically, we're working on borrowed time in the United States and Canada and over most of the world, because we now have these grids that interconnect the high-tech parts of our world, not the Amazon rainforest, but the high-tech parts of the world. And we have this Achilles heel in the grid, and there's a susceptibility to both either solar storms, extreme solar storms, or EMP. And we're not really so far doing anything about protecting them, at least not in this country and not in Canada, except talking about it. They've studied it and talked about it, and they keep talking about it, and they keep thinking maybe they should do something about it, but so far they haven't done anything significant to prevent it. It's kind of like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers warning that the levees outside of New Orleans could not handle a Category 3 or stronger hurricane. And they said, someday we're going to get one of those hurricanes and New Orleans is going to flood and we should fix these levees. And for 30 or 40 years, the government, representatives talked about it. In fact, they even approved money for it at one point, but then, fixing a levee that didn't seem to be broken wasn't very sexy. They'd much rather have a nice sports arena. And so they never fixed the problem, and then the storm came and hit, and we lost New Orleans. Well, now we're talking about an electromagnetic storm that's a guaranteed event. Statistically happens once every eight decades. And then the other event is a terrorist attack with an EMP nuclear device, which may or may not happen. But there's a significant chance of the terrorist attack happening, and there's a guaranteed event that the sun event's going to happen. We just don't know when, and they know how to fix the problem. They just haven't fixed it. So this is kind of scary. Then the last part, that's the actually most scary part of the whole equation, is that nuclear power plants are extremely susceptible to the EMP. In other words, the digital control systems that run and cool and control our nuclear power plants will fry in the event of a terrorist EMP attack instantaneously. And so 15 or 20 minutes later, we'll be in a Fukushima meltdown scenario in the event of an EMP, unless they fix it and provide EMP-hardened systems, backup systems, to at least keep the reactors from melting down in the event of an EMP. And they haven't done that yet. In the event of a solar storm, it's a slower meltdown problem in that the solar storm doesn't have the E1 or E2 effects, but it takes the grid down for months to years. And if we have an extreme one, like the 1921 event or the 1859 event, then you're going to see the projection of a storm as strong as the 1921 event, which is 50% weaker than the 1859 event. So based on, they based their computer studies on the 1921 event, where they figured a 1 in 8 decade event, and the 1829 or the 1859 Carrington event was like a 1 in 500 year type storm. So they based their studies on that, and they said, what would happen to the grid? So the computer model simulations indicate that we'd lose 370 of these giant transformers in the event of a 1921 size electromagnetic storm. Now, it totally crippled South Africa when they lost 14 of these. So if America was to lose 370 in the United States alone, I asked the guy who was in charge of the simulation, John Kappenman, who did the study that was sponsored by the Homeland Security and Oak Ridge National Labs, and he was in charge of the study. And I said, well, how many do you think we'd lose in the world? And he said, I don't know, we didn't study the world. So I said, well, what do you think, 2,000? He said, yeah, that's a pretty good guess. So you say, well, how long would it take to make 2,000 transformers to replace what would go away in a single storm? Well, we make about 100 a year around the world right now. So that's like 20 years to replace those transformers. And that would be with a world that's totally crippled and messed up all over, trying to, get production going and replace those transformers to get our grid back up and running. So we're looking at a pretty serious long-term situation. So the next part of the equation is, when you look at how the Fukushima meltdown occurred, back in 2011 or whenever the Fukushima melted down, they had a massive earthquake, and when the earthquake hit, it took the grid down instantly. Now, a nuclear power plant cannot function without a functioning grid. So when the grid goes down, when there's a local power outage, then the nuclear power plants are designed to automatically go into emergency shutdown mode. So the control rods lower down automatically when the power is cut into the core to start slowing down the reaction. But a nuclear reaction is not like flipping the switch on your lights. It's something that slows down. It doesn't just stop. So for the next 3 to 5 years, they have to keep water flowing through the core of that reactor to keep it cooled. Otherwise, it'll overheat and start blowing and burning up the core and melting the core down and perhaps causing explosions like Fukushima happened. So in the case, in fact, I spoke with Arnie Gunderson, who is #1 in his class in nuclear engineering and is kind of my favorite nuclear whistleblower. Nuclear industry decided to make an example of him when he reported some unsafe businesses that he felt he was duty-bound to report in nuclear storage, and they ruined him and bankrupted him and all of that. And he was like a total pro-nuclear guy back in those days, and before Chernobyl and before Fukushima happened, and before they decided to make an example of what they do with anybody who airs nuclear's dirty laundry. So he was telling me, he was schooling me in this. I'm a Bachelor of Science mechanical engineering. I'm not a nuclear engineer, I'm a mechanical engineer. So he said in Fukushima, after the cores had been cooled down for 8 months, in other words, if you turn off a reactor and cool and allow that to cool down and keep cooling water flowing through it for 8 months, if you lost coolant, if you lost power to the pumps, then 8 months later, it would, in 38 hours after losing cooling, it would still melt down. Now, in Fukushima's case, what happened is the earthquake came along, it wiped out the grid because this massive, like 9-point earthquake, huge giant earthquake hit. And so all the reactors all around Japan go into emergency shutdown mode. Well, 20 minutes later, the tsunami comes along, and in Fukushima, Daiichi, there were 6 nuclear reactors there in that complex. 2 of the 6 were shut down, thank God, were shut down for refueling, so they weren't even operating at the time. They had no fuel rods in them. There's nothing going on in 2 of the 6. The other 4, 3 of the 4 had their pumps, their backup pumps and generators were on the ocean side, and they got wiped out by the tsunami. No, and then only the number 6 generator had the generator, number 6 power plant had the generator on the uphill side. And so that was the only one that had generators and pumps that were still functioning. So 20 minutes after the earthquake, the tsunami comes along. It wipes out 5 out of the 6 banks of pumps and generators to keep water flowing in them. So number 6 is the only one that kept functioning and they kept cooling when they were in emergency shutdown mode and didn't melt down. 2 of them were shut down already, so they were okay. And then the other 3, 2 of them were in total meltdown, like between 15 minutes and a half hour later. They were totally screwed. They were never going to work again. They're complete nuclear disaster. And then number 5 got shunted to number 6 by emergency workers, and they were able to save that to only have a partial meltdown instead of a total meltdown. So now it's not like engineers get to study what happens. Now they do. But when they were designing these things, they didn't really know what happened in a failure mode. So they projected things, and they're smart guys, and they try to calculate, and they try to do a good job of figuring out how to make these safe. And they sold nuclear power to the world on the basis that the chances of a single nuclear power plant having an extreme problem like Fukushima, like Chernobyl, or like 3 Mile Island was less than 1 in a million years of operation. So given that safety record, then with 400 going on in the world, it should have been about 2,000 years before we had our first severe nuclear accident. That's what they sold the bill of goods to the world on. But now we've had Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and 3 meltdowns in Fukushima. So in 50 years of nuclear operation, we've had 5 meltdowns. That's an average of 1 extreme nuclear event that's billions of dollars. And in a nuclear waste problem that will never go away for thousands of years, and we've had now 1 every 10 years, and yet they sold the world on how safe this stuff that it would be at least the number of power plants we have in the world right now should be at least 2,000 years before we have a problem. So they overestimated the safety factor by a factor of 200 to 1. So, obviously, if the countries are told, don't worry, you're only going to have a major nuclear meltdown once every 10 years, it's not a problem, right? No wonder we would have bought that. But once every 2,000 years, they figured, I'll be long dead, and, it's not going to be a problem. Everything's going to be okay. So, next question.
Would it be easier to successfully detonate a nuclear bomb on soil or in the atmosphere?
Much easier on soil. On soil, you could easily get a nuclear device. Is pretty small. I mean, they're like maybe not a suitcase, but like a trunk. You could have a nice tactical nuke that would be a city buster, in a little shipping container, loaded onto a U-Haul van, and parked anywhere you want, and leave it in the van and go away, and boom, it goes off. And so that would be quite easy, relatively speaking. To get it up in the air, you have to have the technology. But, for instance, you could get one of those little small-scale tactical nukes and get a Scud missile. You can buy a Scud missile on the black market for $5 or $10 million, well within the financial capabilities of any one of 1,000 oil sheiks somewhere, or terrorist organizations that's well connected to someone with money. And you certainly have the guys with the programming skills and knowledge in Korea and in Iran and in Pakistan. Like I said, is the one that scares me the most, even though they're, quote, a friend. And because honestly, I think Iran wanted nuclear nukes to counter Israel, so they couldn't be bullied by Israel. But it's the other countries and the terrorist organizations getting one out of one of the failed states, former states in the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, or wherever, the Ukraine, place like that, or getting one out of Pakistan. That scares me, or North Korea, supplying it. That scares me. I have a PowerPoint presentation I give at a lot of prepping shows, and at one point I was in a conference on EMP with General Krosniak, who is now retired, and he was the guy who took over Abu Ghraib when there was such a terrible reputation for torture and abuse of prisoners in Afghanistan on the part of the United States. And so he was sent in to clean it up, and he's really a good man. And he shared with me a slide for my slideshow, my PowerPoint show, and that slide shows 2 nuclear-capable missiles, and then it shows a big, giant freighter that was filled with 10,000 100-pound sacks of sugar. And that freighter was pulled to the side in the Panama Canal, and they unloaded all those sugar sacks, and there was 2 nuclear-capable missiles underneath the sugar sacks. And my guess is, I'm not privy to that information, but my guess is the spy satellites watched those missiles, were watching the missiles being built at some place in North Korea, and watched them trucked and loaded onto this freighter and covered up with sugar sacks, and tracked it across the ocean. And then when it was in a place that was under U.S. control in the Panama Canal, then they sent their boys in to arrest those guys and pull the ship to the side and unload all the sugar sacks and find those nuclear-capable missiles underneath. So seeing those pictures, and they're real pictures, and those are real missiles, and that was a real freighter filled with sugar sacks, that's pretty scary stuff. And so it's clear, that's one that I've seen the actual pictures of. How many other attempts have been done and caught, and that we never hear of, I have no idea.
They do that all the time, I noticed. They'll allow drug rings and all sorts of criminal empires to exist just to monitor them.
Well, you can't always send in your troops to the other countries and invade them and do stuff. I mean, we like to think that the world operates like Rambo, and the United States does to some extent. So, for example, this is a very interesting thing that most people don't have any awareness of. It's often touted how Obama came in and sent the helicopters in, and they got bin Laden. And it's like, a big black ops, secret ops thing that happened. Well, there's a backstory to that. And some of those things, the public story didn't really quite make sense. So there's two different backstories I'm totally aware of. One is that Lockheed Martin Marietta had provided a top-notch, super tech, state-of-the-art radar system to protect Pakistan, because Pakistan's a friend, and they have problems and issues with India and Pakistan, and so we kind of want to maintain the balance there so that one's not stronger than the other. And so they would have seen any American incoming helicopters, and they would have been able to intercept or do anything like that. So that's one part of the weird part of the equation. The next part is that bin Laden was a superhero in Pakistan to the Islamic peoples of Pakistan, because he thumbed his nose at the United States and he'd successfully evaded capture and all of that for a long period of time. So from that perspective, the government in Pakistan knew that if they colluded with the United States in catching bin Laden, that it would take the government down. The people would take the government down because he was such a hero. And so now the third part that comes in really unusual is my publicist became the publicist for a plastic surgeon in Houston, Texas. I think it's Houston. It might be Dallas. Actually, I think it's Houston. And he is kind of considered to be this sort of angel, messenger of God kind of guy in Pakistan, because he's gone to Pakistan on his own dime, and he's performed cosmetic surgeries for people with hair, lips, and physical disfigurement. And so the people there just totally love him. Well, 2 years before the killing of bin Laden sent a message to this guy when he was in Pakistan and said he wanted to meet with him. And he met with him, and they met 2 or 3 different times. And the guy in Pakistan gave this cosmetic surgeon felt duty bound, so he got a meeting with some lower people in the CIA and government officials back in the United States. And this is a well-to-do Republican, well-respected plastic surgeon, and he wrote a book called Tears in the Desert, I think is the name of the book. And so he's in Pakistan. He's met with bin Laden 2 or 3 times. He's seen the compound where he lives. So he contacts, government officials, and they get him in with CIA guys, and they're very excited, very excited. It goes up the chain, and then all of a sudden, silence. Nothing happens. And like 2 years go by, and nothing happens. And then finally, there's this. It's announced that they didn't want to say anything until it's happened, and that they've just now found bin Laden, and they had a secret operation. They executed him. So it's like, wait a minute. There's all these weird pieces of the puzzle here. So here's my take on it. My take on it is that for years, the Pakistani government knew exactly where bin Laden was. And they protected him from the West, but they even shared with the West where he was. And at some point, and so I think when this plastic surgeon came and wanted to tell people where bin Laden was, they already knew where he was. And they were keeping an eye on him. But they had to figure out how to take him down without taking down the friendly government of Pakistan. So finally, they arranged this black ops. They had Pakistan turn off their radar and flew in at the night. And Pakistan government pretended to not know anything about it and be all upset about America doing it behind their back and all of this as part of a face-saving thing. And so it was a big collusion, and they took out bin Laden, and he was just an old aging man with his wife and kids, and shot in front of everybody. And not that I feel that sorry for him, it's just that I think that the officers who were in charge of it, the guys in charge of it felt kind of weird, like they're just going in and doing a hit on this old guy. But of course they knew it was bin Laden and who he was, so they probably didn't feel too bad about it. But there had to be a public story for it. But in the back, it was, I think, very carefully orchestrated and planned over a very long period of time in collusion with Pakistan's government in such a way that Pakistan would not be fingered and that the people of Pakistan would not be outraged because to them bin Laden was their hero.
I noticed that Pakistan was not included in that list of excluded countries, the terrorist-prone nations. Iran is.
Right. Well, Pakistan is still colludes with the United States and is still we kind of have an uncomfortable relationship with them, but we have a relationship with them. They're not, they allow U.S. military operations to take off and land in Pakistan. And so, there's a lot of, you scratch our back, we'll scratch yours kind of stuff between us and Pakistan. And so, but there's concerns because, our military guys are concerned because they know the extent of fundamental Islamic infiltration within the military and the government, so that there's a significant possibility that something nasty is going to come out of Pakistan and hit the United States someday. And that won't be because the government wants it. That will be because some people went rogue within the government and the military and did it, behind without official consent.
Using the weapons that they purchased from the United States.
No, some of them, the radar and things, but they have.
Well, I think a lot of their fighter jets, if I recall, there was a big contract.
Right. But when I was at MIT, there was a lot of Pakis in my dorm because I lived in kind of the cheapest dorm, and it was an old rundown apartment building, and it had suites that were like old apartments that had their own kitchens, and so they could cook their own food there. And there was a rumor one day, they were all celebrating because there was a rumor that the military dictator had been overthrown and executed. And they were all celebrating because they were all sent there by their government, and they knew they were going to have to go back. And they really liked the freedom in America, and they didn't like they were really hoping that their military dictator was going to be overthrown, and they were celebrating. You should have seen these guys celebrating that night. And then it turned out to just be a rumor, and they're all bummed out. It's like, oh, well, we still go back, and we owe our lives to our government that sent us here at MIT. So a lot of those guys were electrical engineers, computer scientists, nuclear engineers, aero-astro engineers. They were really, they were smart guys. So Pakistan has they have some really smart guys who are trained at MIT in the best schools in the world for nuclear engineering and aero and astro and electrical engineering. So they've got some pretty high tech guys on staff there. They built them. They did their nuclear industry from the ground up. We didn't sell them that. We didn't give them that. They did that themselves. Now we sold them a lot of other stuff, but we didn't sell them that stuff.
It's kind of like this Y2K thing. There, a lot of misconceptions, right? For example, prisons. Let's say there's an EMP. What would happen to all the prisoners during such an event?
Well, they're probably going to starve. In the event of an EMP, then essentially all of the grid's going to be down for months to years. No grid. The backup generators that the prison has to run the lights and things like that, they're going to run out of fuel, within a week's time. All of the heating, ventilation, air conditioning is probably run with digital control systems. That's going to fail right off the bat. The light switches, if they've got a generator that survived the EMP, then the light switches will go. The chances that their generator survived the EMP is quite slim. In 1961, the United States did our first EMP test called Starfish Prime, and they blew off something like a 10 megaton device, like a really big one, in above Johnston Island, and that's like 900 miles south of Honolulu. And the sky lit up amazing colors in Honolulu, 900 miles away, and a bunch of streetlights failed in Honolulu. And about 30 or 40 cars didn't start in Honolulu, and a telephone switching station on Kauai, 1,000 miles away from Johnston Island, burned up and failed. So that wasn't that serious, but this is like 900 to 1,000 miles away from where the EMP happened. Now, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist who'd done all the EMP calculations for this test was off by a factor of 10 to 1. It just, it's not like he did theoretical calculations. They didn't really understand it. It's not like they'd been able to study it before. So when they did this test, all of their instruments on the warships around Johnston Island were totally decked. Imagine driving your car in the Bonneville Salt Flats and setting a land speed record with a jet-powered car and you're going 900 to 1,000 miles an hour, but your speedometer only goes to 100 miles an hour. You have no idea how fast you went because you decked your speedometer out at 100 miles an hour and you're going somewhere around 1,000. So that's kind of what happened. So they had to calculate that EMP effect based on instruments in Honolulu, 1,000 miles away, 900 miles away from Johnston Island. Now, when the Soviets did their similar EMP blast, they did it over Kazakhstan, kind of in the middle, placed out in the middle of nowhere, far away. And they had similarly underestimated the effect. Now they knew they were planning on losing power, so they had a bunch of diesel generators. Now realize these are 1961 generators that were the pre-microelectronic things that are supposedly robust and very durable to an EMP because they don't have the tiny little traces that burn out like microelectronic chips do, microelectronic chips have. And so they had all these backup diesel generators on hand, and they did their test over Kazakhstan. Well, what happened was that blast went off, and it induced such strong ground currents that the power station that was 1,000 kilometers away, that's 600 miles away from where the EMP test was, there was a power trunk line that was buried 2 meters underground. That's 6 feet underground, and it's 1,000 kilometers, 600 miles away. And the ground currents induced in that trunk line were so powerful it burned down the power station that was 600 miles away. Not only that, almost all of those backup diesel generators that were placed on hand to provide power in the event the grid went down, which they assumed the grid was going to go down, almost all of them failed to start after that test. Now, it turned out that because Kazakhstan is so much closer to the pole than Johnston Island, which is near the equator, the electromagnetic effect was 4 times as strong as the Johnston Island one. So if you think about it, think about a magnet. Did you ever use a horseshoe magnet in the sand and get iron filings when you were a kid? Did you ever do that?
No.
Well, anyway, if you have a horseshoe magnet, you'll notice that nothing sticks to the middle of the magnet. It all sticks at the North Pole and the South Pole of the magnet. And so when you're in the middle of the magnet, which is like the equator, then the field from the North Pole and the South Pole kind of balance each other out. There's not much of an electromagnetic field. We still have gravity in the middle, but we don't have the electromagnetic field there because the North and South Poles balance each other out. So the EMP effect is much, much less the closer you get to the equator. So the further you get from the equator, the further towards the poles, then the stronger, for a given electromagnetic device at a given height, the stronger the electromagnetic effect is going to happen from a given nuclear device. So so here's 2 things to balance. Now, if you look at the simulated EMP tests that the United States did, and those results are published in the EMP study. In around 2010, Congress funded a bipartisan EMP commission, so Republicans and Democrats to be on this EMP commission. It was headed by Dr. William Graham. I keep wanting to call him Billy Graham, but that's a different kind of doctor, Billy Graham. The preacher guy is not the same as the nuclear engineer guy. So Dr. William Graham was Ronald Reagan's chief science advisor, and he was active in the Department of Defense's nuclear program for about 30 years, and he was the head of this commission. And Dr. William Graham came to the same conclusion, totally independently of me, that in the event of an EMP or an extreme solar storm, that we're going to have multiple Fukushima-like events across North America, and that we need to do something to protect ourselves from this, and that if we don't, in either event, either the EMP or the super solar storm, then it'll be the end of the United States forever, basically because of the multiple Fukushima-like events. It's like the EMP will be bad enough, the starvation will be bad enough, the frying of all of those billions of dollars worth of electronics that'll take many, many years to replace will be bad enough. But the meltdowns of the nuclear power plants will poison much of North America for generations to come and render it uninhabitable. So that's like an extreme event, end of the world as we know it, and yet our governments aren't doing much about it. So back onto what actually fails. So in the simulated, in the actual EMP test done in EMP labs that the Department of Defense uses in the United States, they found that roughly only 15% of cars driving down the road will fail in a standard EMP attack. Now, this is EMP, not solar. Remember, the EMP affects the small electronics. The solar just affects the big picture, just taking down the grid, but the rest of the stuff is still okay. In the EMP, it takes out, all kinds of levels of electronics, especially everything networked together. So they found that only 15% of the cars would fail. That most of the rest would have funny anomalies, but they'd still start and they'd still work. Because cars are designed to be, they have sparky things going on in cars. So they're already designed to be robust electronically to handle a lot of sparky type things going on. And they're also insulated from the road. They're not like networked together with lots of wire or anything like that. But they found that, many of your small electronic devices would be okay. But they found that essentially 100% failure happens in any digital control system, anything that's networked together, all of our stuff that controls our factories, our refineries, our nuclear power plants, our internets, our phone systems, our heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems, all of those things, essentially 100% failure. Not that every component fails, but enough components in the systems fail that the systems just won't work anymore.
An audience question here.
Yeah.
Don't forget about alternative energy sources. Will they get cooked? What about windmills?
Well, in the event of an EMP, well, see, there's a good news, bad news about EMP versus solar storms. The good news about the EMP is that they're a limited zone. If it's a small device, you're talking a couple hundred miles. If it's a bigger missile getting it up higher, you're talking like 500 to 1,500, 2,000 miles. If you're talking a super high device, big Soviet device, maybe Pakistani or Chinese, you're talking all of North America maybe, or at least certainly all the United States. But the good news there is that the rest of the world can come in, the cavalry can come in to help deal with this giant area where the electronics is fried and provide relief. So that's the good news, bad news about the EMP. The solar storm, the good news is that it's not frying all of the little stuff, just the grid. But the bad news is that it's frying the grid over most of the northern and southern hemispheres, except for the deep tropical zones. So in that case, you'd be relying on places like India, Mexico, and the Philippines, and Indonesia to come to the rescue of the rest of the world and help put it back together again. So there you're talking like a huge part of the world that's just in massive disarray where there's no grid. Backup generators are working so long as they can get fuel. But how are you going to get, the fuel lines will start failing soon. The natural gas lines are all now, most of them have been, quote, upgraded to electric pumps instead of gas turbine pumps. They used to compress their own gas burning gas in gas turbines to compress the natural gas to keep it flowing in natural gas pipelines. That took more maintenance and was more expensive than electric pumps. So now most of them have been changed and upgraded to electric pumps. So when the grid's down, then even the natural gas will stop flowing. So when the grid's down, your refineries stop working, your natural gas stops flowing, your sewage plants stop working, your power plants aren't working, your phone systems aren't working. In 3 hours, your cell phones start losing backup battery charges at the cell phone towers. And in 3 days, your hospitals and your police will have run out of backup fuel. And in a week to 30 days, your nuclear power plants will have run out of backup fuel to keep their pumps going, to keep the power plants from melting down Fukushima style. So, and then the problem is if you've got like massive riots and people starving, and how is the government going to make sure that trucks full of diesel run on down the road and are not intercepted and are peacefully delivering backup diesel to the nuclear power plants to keep them from melting down? So it's like this cascading failure. We saw how in Hurricane Katrina that in the areas in the Gulf Coast that were devastated, that things got worse and worse and worse for the first 2 to 3 weeks, and then finally, relief was coming in from outside to make them better and better and better. So in the event of a solar storm, your alternative energy is going to work great. Your solar panels are going to be good. Your wind turbines are going to be good. Your battery backups are going to be good. Your inverters are going to be good. You're going to be cool. You're going to be set. If you got a good, nice solar backup thing, at least you'll keep water pumping, keep the heat going, keep the lights on. So that's cool. In the event of an EMP, your diodes that protect your solar panels are going to probably fry. All of your digital stuff inside of your cool battery controllers and your inverters is going to fry. And so all of that cool renewable energy stuff you got, unless you got an old-fashioned Pelton wheel with a little DC generator on it, that's all that stuff's going to be done. Your batteries will still work, but your panels are gone. So what do you do? So if you're really worried about an EMP, you get a lot of backup spare parts protected with double Faraday cages, and I'll explain what that is right now. Unless if you want, I'll go into that right now.
Go right ahead.
Okay. So what a Faraday cage is a metal box. And what happens then in an EMP situation is if you've got electronics stored within this metal box, the EMP wave comes along and it induces this huge current into the outside of the box, and it kind of spreads all around the box, and electromagnetically it reflects through the box onto itself, and you have a balanced field inside. So the box itself takes the zap from the field, but then it's equally distributed around the outside of the box, and so it's a net zero field inside the box. So a double Faraday cage, because nothing's perfect, the best way to deal with this is you make a double Faraday cage. So what that means is, say you've got like a backup CB radio that you want to protect, and say you've got a nice little inverter that you want to protect, and a little battery charge controller you want to protect, and a couple of solar panels you want to protect, some small ones that can charge some batteries, listen to your cell phone, charge your iPhone or whatever, and maybe if an extra iPhone or something, but some basic electronics. So what you do is you take each of these devices and you wrap them in aluminum foil, and then you double wrap them in an insulating layer, like a thick poly bag, and then if you can, you take these devices and then you put them in, like, say, a galvanized garbage can or a big old refrigerator you got from the dump, a cast-off refrigerator. And then what you do is, so that's the internal Faraday cage, is the aluminum foil wrap with no gaps in it that totally wraps each individual device. Each individual device is then insulation wrapped. And if you can, wrap them in some cardboard, something to give it some thickness. Because if you got a really thin piece of plastic and you do get a spark through from the outside can to the inside, it's a gap related thing. So if you can have more, instead of like a 5,000 thick piece of plastic, if you can have plastic and then like a little layer of cardboard around there, then it's a much bigger gap. And then the outside thing, what you have to do is you have to have no gaps in the garbage can or the microwave oven or the old refrigerator you're using for your outer second box in the Faraday cage, the double part of the Faraday cage. So what you do is you go around your galvanized garbage can and you get some aluminum foil and you jam it into the cracks in between the lid and the main body and make sure there's no crack there. And then the other thing you can do is you can get metal tape, HVAC tape, and it's got a thin insulating layer on it, but it'll still leave just a very thin insulated layer. And you can tape all the seams in your refrigerator in your galvanized garbage can with this metal tape. It looks like aluminum foil, but it's got a sticky back on it, and it's kind of tough. And they use them for, it's kind of like high temperature duct tape that you use on metal ducting, and you can get it at Home Depot or other big supply places. Now, people often ask the question, they say, well, should I ground my stuff to protect it? And I'd say there is, if you go to my website, whentechfails.com, and you click on, at the top you'll see it'll float through with 3 different kind of headlines, and you click on the one that says survival articles, and the first article in there is 400 Chernobyls. And at the end of 400 Chernobyls, which I talk about a lot of the stuff we're talking about now in great detail, I have 25 different hot links for really valuable information that I used when I was writing the article 400 Chernobyls. One of those hot links is a link to the free military guide for grounding and bonding for EMP protection. And so if you're a electrical technician quality guy or electrical hobbyist or an engineer, and you're sure that you could follow the directions in the military guide to grounding and bonding, then go right ahead and do that. However, if you're not really good at that stuff, I've got it from Jerry, not Rasmussen, Jerry, oh gosh, I gotta look up. Anyway, there's a Jerry Emanuelson has written a really good book on electronic protection, EMP, and he's got a future science website. So if you just put Jerry Emanuelson in on Google and EMP, you'll come right to it. And Jerry was a electrical tech in the military in Colorado, and he's done a lot of this stuff. And so he says that in tests, that if you mess up on the grounding and don't do it right, then the ground currents are so strong in an EMP that you're going to be worse off than if you didn't ground it. So basically, Jerry says, if you're really confident and you want to look up the mil specs and how to do it right, then go ahead and do it. Otherwise, don't ground your stuff. Just do a double Faraday cage. I know it was a long answer, but I wanted to give you enough information so that you could make a rational, good judgment instead of jumping to the conclusion. And remember, those ground currents were so strong in the EMP test in Kazakhstan that they burned down the electric power plant 600 miles away, and in a line that was buried 2 meters underground. So, that's a pretty strong ground currents.
Your book, When Technology Fails, it's really cool. I mean, it's so comprehensive. If I had found this in a used bookstore, I'd just be freaking out. It's so cool, man.
It's a huge book and a huge effort. But I will say that there's a lot of tremendous information in When Technology Fails. It's not in my second book, When Disaster Strikes, which is When Disaster Strikes is a more condensed manual that's a guide for prepping and survival. But When Disaster Strikes has specific chapters devoted to EMP and solar storms, and another one devoted to surviving a nuclear catastrophe. So the stuff that I'm talking about today, you really want the second book to give you specifics on survival strategies, protection, what do you need to do, what's going to work, what's not going to work for the solar storm and the EMP, beyond what I'm able to tell you on the show. And but if the world melted down tomorrow and you were on your own, there's no more important book to have in your bookcase than When Technology Fails, because that book was downloaded to me in 1997. I had my morning session of meditation, and I made a generic request for guidance and inspiration, and I got a bomb dropped in my lap that morning. I just simply basically said, God, guide me. What am I supposed to do? What do you want me to do? And I received a massive pictorial storyboard style outline for this huge book to help people live more self-reliantly, more sustainably, and to plan for and deal with long-term failures of our central services, including the grid. And I had never in my life remotely considered writing anything like that. And it came as a fully developed outline, massive outline for a massive project. And it took me 3 years to turn that cosmic download into the book When Technology Fails. And then in 2008, I put another year of my life into a huge expansion and updated second edition of When Technology Fails. So what you were looking at, what you've been reading is edition 2, which basically had over a 4-year, is the fruit of 4 years, 3 years of labor, 2 years of lost wages, and all the equity in my home went into writing that book. So, so much easier for you guys than it was for me. It was a labor of love, and I felt duty bound to follow what I'd been given by Spirit to do, and to do my best at turning that vision into a practical handbook for whoever is out there and willing to listen and wants that book.
Why prep when you can simply steal it?
Well, you can't steal talent, you can't steal knowledge, and it's not just your stuff. Your stuff is only going to last so long. In a long-term situation, stealing it. Well, for one thing, I ethically, I don't feel good about stealing it. No,
And
it's a good
sorry,
question. It's a really good question.
I ask because other people are going to be thinking that.
Other people are going to be thinking that, and there's strength in numbers. I think that the lone wolf will be easily picked off by people who are meaner and tougher and better organized than him, because no one can stay awake 24/7. And so there's a lot of strength in numbers. So I think that it's going to be, when things really fall apart, it brings people together in communities. And if you're if you're just by yourself and you don't have any way of protecting yourself, then yeah, you're going to be a sitting duck for somebody. And so in a situation like that, what you're going to want to do is pool together with other people for protection and strength in numbers and shared supplies, shared skills, shared knowledge. No one person can know and do it all. And what you want to be in that situation is to be a partner that other people want to partner with. You know what I'm saying? If you've got nothing to give, you got no skills, you got no talents, you got no knowledge, and you got no stuff. And it's like, hey, buddy, SOL. It's like, go find somebody else to mooch off of. You're not coming over here. Disasters tend to bring out the best and the worst in people. The media likes to focus on the looting and the raping that happened around Hurricane Katrina. But there's also all these amazing stories of people who pulled themselves together and teamed up and worked night and day to help other people. And it tends to bring out the best in many people, as well as the worst in others. And so the more you can be that person who looked ahead and planned ahead. And if you don't have money, then work on your skill set. And if you got money, then, get some stuff because you're going to need to be sharing with other people. And so, no one can know it all and have it all and do it all. And no matter what Donald Trump thinks.
By the way, he can go without sleep.
I guess
he is the one guy that doesn't have to sleep.
He's twittering
24/7
all night long. Yes, but I can't say that he exhibits great judgment without that sleep.
What are common mistakes people make in disaster preparation?
Well, one of the mistakes is not practicing anything. So, like, for instance, and this is an area I've got to work on. I've got all kinds of great survival skills and backcountry skills and stuff because I just love the backcountry. And my parents took me hunting and fishing when I was a little kid, and hiking at age 5 and backpacking at age 6. And I was, winter camping at age 11 and sleeping in the snow. And so I got all those kinds of skills. And I was a really good shot when I was a kid. I was a really good marksman and a good archer. And I really suck now. My son took me shooting a few years ago. He said, "Dad, you suck." It was like, I'd rather go rock climbing or ride my mountain bike or go out on Nordic skis or go out in a kayak any day than go out and shoot a gun. So, but it takes practice and it takes, learning multiple things. I'd say a lot of people, here's another big thing. So, learn, have a big picture. So I was on a radio show about a decade back with a guy in Arizona. I think it was like me and this guy in Arizona and somebody else was the host of the show. And we're all, talking remotely on the show like you and I are right now. And we were chatting, and he said he teaches primitive living skills. And it is probably Cody Lundeen, but I didn't know who he was. He wasn't famous in those days, so I'm not sure if it was Cody Lundeen or not. But it probably was, but I'm not positive. And he said that typically in his class, when they teach primitive living skills, they have a week or so where they're teaching how to do things the Native American way from scratch. Spinning, weaving, no guns, no knives, no fish hooks, no high tech tools. And then at the end of that week's class, then they go out in the wilderness for 3 days, and he says typically they split into groups of men and women, and the men go out and focus on the manly things. Men go out and hunt and fish because that's what men like to do, and the women go out and they forage for edible fruits and nuts and tubers and things like that. And he said come day 3, almost invariably, the women take pity on the starving men, and they share the bounty that they foraged for. Because it turns out that hunting and fishing without high-tech tools is really tough to do. And they're out in Arizona. They're not in some rainforest where there's tons of things all around you, seething all around you. It's like desert. And so a lot of guys figure that their guns and their fish hooks are gonna be all they need. But in a collapse type situation, that stuff is gone really fast. I grew up in Vermont, and everyone wanted to go hunting the first day of hunting season because that's when the game was really plentiful, and by a week later, the game got smart. The ones that weren't shot right off the bat, they learned to make themselves pretty invisible and pretty scarce. And by the end of hunting season, it's pretty tough. I ask this question of groups and crowds often. I say, well, how many of you guys and women that like to hunt have had a really good day on your last day of hunting season? And I've had 3 people raise their hand now out of 1,500. One woman shot a 10-point elk on her last day of hunting season, and another guy got something. And so I've had 3 people out of well over 1,000 people ask that question to actually raise their hand. So in a collapse situation, it's going to be the last day of hunting season 100 times over. I mean, when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, when Gorbachev came in and said, "Okay, that's it. We're shutting down we're shutting it down. It's all over." And suddenly, Cuba and North Korea lost their lifeline to high-tech tools. They lost their lifeline to oil, and they lost their lifeline to spare parts, and they lost their lifeline to pharmaceuticals and engineers and scientists. So that next winter, something like 10 million people starved or died of disease in North Korea because there was if you weren't part of the government, there was massive starvation, and every squirrel and every rat and every mouse was popped in the pot. And if trees were stripped for bark and grass was pulled up and boiled, and if you didn't know how to forage and go out in the forest and scavenge for food, and you weren't part of the pipelines to food through the government or the military, then you were SOL. And now Cuba did a whole lot better. Of course, it's a more mild climate in Cuba, but in Cuba, nobody starved, nobody died. The average Cuban lost 30 pounds. They lost 25% of their calories in their diet. They went from oil-intensive and chemical-intensive farming methods to draft animals and organic farming. They went from high-tech pharmaceuticals to homeopathy and herbs, and life went on quite well in Cuba. But we live in pretty northern climates, and in a collapse situation, to count on your guns and ammos and fish hook to carry you through in a long-term situation, it's going to take a lot more than that.
Do you know how to identify edible mushrooms?
No, I have books. That's one thing that I highly recommend people have in their go bags is books with really good colored pictures. And in fact, if you go to my website, there is recommended books at the bottom of whentechfails.com, and there's links to purchasing a number of recommended books. And a couple of those books in there are on very common. There's a guy who writes these really, really good books on not 10,000 edible plants, but on his 200 favorite. This is a guy who does tons of foraging, and his 200 favorites, and it's got multi-season pictures and colored pictures and really good ways of identifying them and how to cook and prepare them and all of that. So those books, I think it's Samuel Thayer does those, and those books are the ones you really want because a good field guide is extremely important. And no, I stay away from edible mushrooms because I haven't studied them enough to feel comfortable that I'm not going to poison myself. You read accounts of a guy who really knows his stuff and does this all the time, getting the wrong one, and he and his wife are dead. And I don't want to be that guy.
So I'd like to talk about the fiddleheads in your book. Now, when I was a kid, my mom would go out and pick fiddleheads, and she would fry them up in garlic and butter, and they were great. And then she confided in me that she learned later that some fiddleheads are poisonous, and that she didn't know what she was doing. Is there any truth to that?
Well, they're not highly poisonous, but the bracken ones are really bitter, and they can, make cows sick and make people sick. So the furry ones, don't eat the furry ones. We ate the furry ones once. The first time we went out and collected fiddleheads, we got the furry ones. And they were like, "Oh, this is terrible. Oh, God." And then the next time we went out and we got the right ones, and they were great. We're like, "People eat this?"
So you, just like my mom, were eating these things and you didn't even know what you were doing.
No, we didn't know what we were doing. But, the poisonous ones really taste bad, the fiddleheads, so that's not a problem. It's not like the mushrooms. The problem with the mushrooms is they can taste just like the other mushrooms.
You know what's funny about what you just said is that people sometimes fear the wrong things. You wouldn't eat the mushrooms that you didn't know out of fear of poisoning yourself, but you had no problem eating a plant that you weren't sure about or didn't know. And it's actually true that there are far more poisonous plants out there than there are poisonous mushrooms.
That's correct. But the thing is that very few people go collecting plants randomly. Like you don't go out and just eat any plant. I mean, I didn't, anybody did. But mushrooms are like, "Oh, wow, there's a tasty looking mushroom," and so you might eat that tasty looking mushroom and, have it be an amanita or something like that, and you're gone. And not know that you'd eaten something bad. Whereas you eat the wrong fiddlehead, you eat the bracken, and it tastes horrible. And you're not going to swallow that sucker unless you're really, really hungry. And then if you do, you're going to get sick. You're going to puke it up. But it's not going to go into your system and kill you. Now, the one thing that will kill you and does kill people, what is it? Not henbane.
And by the way, the Amanita phalloides, the death cap, is apparently delicious, and you will die within 24 hours after consuming it.
Right. And so, so not everything is a bad taste or flavor. So
right.
I do teach in my books, I do teach the edible plant test. How do you determine, like, if you're stuck and you want to know if this plant's good or not, and so there's a little process you go through, and without rereading it, I'm not sure, I might skip some, but basically you crush it first, and if it smells like almonds, then that's a common plant poison. Don't do it. So, and then you take so after you crush it and smell it, if that test is okay, then you take a little bit of the juice and you kind of rub it on like an arm, like in your elbow, and your sensitive skin inside your elbow, and you see, if you get any rash or any burning or any funny reaction, in the next hour or two on that. And then if that's okay, then you take a little and you crush it and you put it on your lip, and you wait again for another couple hours to see if you have any reaction. And if that's okay, then you take like a little bit and you kind of chew it in your mouth a little and hold it under your tongue for a few minutes and then spit it out and wait a few hours and see if you've had a reaction. And if that's okay, then you eat like a little teaspoon amount and make sure. So that's like the safe plant edibility test, to where you want to, if you want to make really sure, and then and then you just kind of chew it and you get a little juice and then you spit it out, and then you eat like a teaspoon or tablespoon. So you kind of go in stages, and if you get a bad reaction at any one of those stages, then it's like you're done. You're not, that plant's not one you're going to want to eat. So yeah, you're going like really slow and really careful and making sure before you actually, and you start by eating just a pea size and then a mouthful size, and then finally, if you pass all of those, then you can graduate to making yourself a little meal out of it. But most of the really poisonous things, they've got they'll let you know. You'll react to it before you get to the end of the plant edibility test.
A lot of plants have antecedents, and they don't taste very well.
Yes, a lot of them don't. But like you said, some of the mushrooms, that's the problem. They can taste delicious, and you're still dead. Or sometimes you might survive it, but you might be like sick the rest of your life.
Yeah,
right?
or you'll need a liver or a new kidney or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, just a liver. Yeah, not a problem. Yeah, dime a dozen for those, especially after the collapse. Hey, buddy, you got an extra liver you want to give me? No problem. Yeah, come on over.
Right.
Yeah,
You'll be the first person they take care
you
of.
got it. Yeah. If you believe that, I got a bridge to sell you.
No, you're absolutely. You see, this is now when people preach about equality, okay, that's all fine pre EMP, because
Yeah.
post EMP, there's no more equality. Again, it comes down to what do you know.
Yes.
You're the mushroom guy. You're the plants guy. You're the engineer.
You're the healer. You're
Yeah,
the healer.
whatever
You're
you
the
are.
guy who can. You're the guy who can play music. And I love. And you're so funny that even though you're not worth anything else, at least you can help us be entertained and feel good when the world's falling apart around us. So it's like something you can contribute. And hopefully you're not just the guy who's contributing his ribs to be a rack of lamb on the fire that day.
Well, like these people on these shows, my 600-pound mother or whatever they are,
Right.
these aren't the people that people can take care of in these times.
Yeah. Well, except they may just, lie around and get trim and slim and last everybody else. That's a possibility. It's I've fasted. I've done a 10-mile run after a week-long fast and in the high Sierras. And I wasn't running at race pace, but I was able to run 10 miles after a week-long fast. And so if you detox yourself with enemas and things, you can do amazing things without food. If you wash your colon out and detox yourself, you'll find that you can go a long, long time living on stored reserves in your body. And you may not, and actually have remarkable energy and remarkable strength.
So I have it
Because,
all wrong. These 600-pound people would be the best off. They have all these reserves.
well, they might be, except they might also, yeah, who knows?
I'm bugging
Yeah.
you.
It's like, I wouldn't bank on it. Put it that way. I think being in shape and having some skills and talents is probably a much safer insurance package than having 600 extra pounds. And your alternative healing things. I have a huge chapter on alternative healing stuff in when technology fails, and a smaller chapter with kind of your top 10 things to have on hand in when disaster strikes. And because what's going to happen? Where's a city of 10 million people going to pee and poo when there's no sewage pumps running and no water running? And so as soon, shortly after things go down, then there's going to be cholera and there's going to be epidemic and there's going to be pandemic. And so if you don't have a colloidal silver generator or homeopathy or know your way around herbs or have just a really strong constitution that never gets sick, then when you're blowing things out at both ends, you're not going to be able to go very far or do very much, and it's not going to be any fun.
It sounds to me like you want to get out of the city post haste.
Yes, totally correct. And either that, or you've got some magical little place you can hole up for a long time and then leave, later when things have quieted down. So, but you're right that the chances are that a week or two downstream, most people will stay around probably waiting for things to get better, waiting for the cavalry to come in, and that's where knowledge is so important. Because if you know that it was an EMP or a solar storm, you know that it's going to be a long, long, long haul.
But how are you going to know?
Well, there are certain signs. The solar storm is like the sky is lit up blood red and orange and just an amazing light show for like at least for hours on end, if not days on end. The 1921 Great Geomagnetic Storm lit up the sky from the North Pole to Puerto Rico and Hawaii, and from the South Pole to American Samoa, as did the 1859 Carrington event. The 1859 Carrington event was a 1-2 blast. There was a giant coronal mass ejection out of the sun, like a big burp of massive sun stuff going at like 1,000 times faster than our fastest rockets fly, coming out of the sun, and it hit the Earth. And 2 days later, a second CME came out of the sun and also went straight to the Earth. And so it's named the Carrington event because Richard Carrington, this British astronomer, had observed these was observing sunspots and saw these coronal mass ejections happen, and did some electromagnetic measurements of, some kind of stuff coming off the sun. And so that's why it's called the Carrington event, because he was observing it with his telescope and saw it. And so just as the Earth was electromagnetically kind of calming down from the first CME that hit the Earth, then the second one hit the Earth, and that spun it up again. So basically it was a full week of both the North and South poles at night. Almost the whole planet was lit up at night. The night in the northern half and then the night in the southern half, except for the very, very deep tropical zones was all that didn't see the northern and southern lights. So that's the kind of event we're talking about, like amazing northern lights that you've never seen before, like lights seen down in Cuba and Hawaii and Florida, and you've probably seen some good northern lights up there in BC. I know I have when I was in BC.
Well, I live in Vancouver. You don't really get it.
Oh, yeah, okay, because you got the ocean moisture and stuff. But yeah, but when I was 16, I was climbing in the Rogers Pass and Banff Jasper areas, and we had some really great northern lights.
No, I lived in Alberta too, and I've seen them around Jasper, and they're unbelievable.
Yeah. And I've seen them in Vermont when I was a little kid. I saw them a couple of times in Vermont. But what's been described from the 1921 event and Carrington event was just, way beyond anything I saw in BC as a kid or Vermont as a kid. And certainly I've never seen them down here in California, where I live in the high Sierras. Even though I'm in the big mountains, I'm that much further south from Vermont or BC than I've never seen them down here. Been here for 30 years.
By the way, for all the BC survivalists, here's a tip for you. There are no poisonous purple berries in British Columbia.
Ooh, nice to know.
Yeah, if you see a purple berry, it's edible. Now, another piece in your book, you have dowsing in there. Dowsing has been debunked, right? Richard Dawkins talked to, others.
Believe me, there are. It's not, put it this way, I don't think it's been adequately explained because it goes beyond rational physics as we know it. So just because a physicist says it's bunk doesn't mean it's bunk. If you've ever felt dowsing rods do their thing and then have it proven right by digging a well, you'll know it's real. But not everybody can douse. Not everybody can do it. And how it works, I don't understand it. I don't really totally get it, but I know it works. And at least it works for some people all the time. And for many people, probably some of the time. And for some people, none of the time. So it's not something that anybody will pick up the same stick and get the same result. Because there's some kind of interaction between your mind, your spirit, and that rod. And it's just the piece of stick isn't doing it, or the metal rods aren't doing it by themselves. They have to have a human transceiver holding them, and some of those human devices will work and some of them won't.
Regardless if you're in camps, you'll have your dowsing guy.
That's correct. As you might have your person who's good with hands-on healing.
If you had 30 people and they had this book, and they were all relatively intelligent and literate people, you'd be doing okay.
You would be,
honestly.
In that, for instance, there's one of the last chapters is like.
And excuse me, I said this book, but we know there's more than one. There's also When Disaster Strikes.
Right. The When Technology Fails book is the big encyclopedic, comprehensive book that you want if you want to live more sustainably and self-reliantly while the world's working well, or if you want to be able to plan and deal with and cope with if the world is really not doing well, whether it's for a week or a month or multiple years. You'd want that book. And whereas When Disaster Strikes is basically a prepping and survival guide, and whereas When Tech Fails is a much broader net, covers spinning, weaving, glass blowing, making a backyard foundry, primitive, basic soap making, how to make butter, how to make soap, how to spin, how to make a fishing net, how to make a timber framed home, a log structure, how to do a renewable energy system. So it's a combination of low tech and high tech. It's old fashioned skills that, in our grandparents' age or great grandparents' age, someone in every town knew how to make, grow, or build or fabricate the basics of what would be needed for a decent standard of living. And so if the world fell apart, none of us could go out and replicate an iPhone or a semiconductor chip. But we could go out and replicate the technologies of Abraham Lincoln's day and Thomas Jefferson's day and George Washington's day. We could replicate those technologies. And so those technologies are taught to in my book, and then each chapter ends in the resource guide. So if you want to go further than I was able to go in the book, because I can't write everything about everything in the world, then it guides you to the best books and sources for materials to go further than I could take you in the book. But I've tried to give enough illustrations, enough information that if someone was pretty intelligent and they only had my book, then they could do it. Maybe not everybody in the group could, but at least one of the two of those people in the group could look at that and say, yeah, I could do that, and figure it out. Like I have log tables and trig tables, so if there's no calculators working, and I have some basic equations. So you could use those equations if you have an engineering mind, and the log tables and trig tables and the strength tables in there, and you could say, oh, if I felled those trees that are this diameter and this type of wood, I could make a bridge across this river and it would hold up so many thousands of pounds. So somebody in that group could use the information I have in the book to figure that out and to use my book to do that.
Can you do everything in these books?
A huge amount of it. I've cast metal, I've blown glass, my mom was a spinner and a weaver and a canner. I have not tanned leather myself, but I have, gutted animals and shot and fish and I've talked to guys directly who are really good at tanning leather, and they helped me fine tune the tanning leather sections to make sure I had it right, and I'm confident that I could follow their instructions as I wrote down in there and tan a hide if I needed to. So I've done a remarkable amount of what's in the book, but if you look in the acknowledgments at the front of the book, you'll see about 70 different experts that I acknowledge as having helped me in the book. So I don't claim to, and I bought about $10,000 of research books between the first and second edition.
Yeah, and it has a huge bibliography.
Huge. I mean, I read more books doing the first edition of this book. I read more books than I had my entire life. MIT, high school, grade school, and 20 years after college before I wrote this book. And I read more writing this book than all the rest of my life put together. And then I spent another, I probably read another 30 books or 20 books when I was writing the second edition. So, yeah, huge bibliography and a huge time investment on my part. But so I can't claim I've done everything in the book, but I've done a lot. I've been doing alternative healing stuff too for like 30 years. So,
you ever snared a wild animal?
I haven't snared a wild animal. No.
I've tried.
It's not easy.
It's so hard. Yeah, I've made the little one where you do the tunneling, and at the end of it, there's a noose.
Right.
So the idea is a rabbit runs down the tunnel, and never happens.
Most effective hunters, they'll place 20 snares or something like that.
Right.
Real hunters like Bushmen that they count on this stuff, they have a whole loop. They don't count on one of these things catching something. They got like 20 traps set.
See, now that's a good point, because I think most people would make one, and that's it. They would say, well, we got a trap out there.
Right. And then they wait and look every day, and it's like, once every 2 weeks something gets in the trap. Yeah. And so, no, people who live that way, they set lots of them. And that's, a lot of, I probably should have said that in the book. I don't think I did. It's like, don't count on this one little trap. There's some really cool little pictures telling you how to do this, but that's where my advice about the foraging is so important, because push comes to shove, the foragers, the hunting is like to supplement what you get foraging, and most people think it's the other way around.
So do you think that men did the foraging too, or were they primarily hunters?
Oh yeah, they did it all. You were out foraging and hunting. you're doing it. Yeah, you're not just hunting. If you saw a mushroom, you picked it up. If you saw this, you picked it up. That kind of thing. You're out doing different things.
So it's still manly to go out and forage for berries and nuts.
Sure, it is. It's just the Western guys who think that that's not manly.
Yeah, couple of great books. When Disaster Strikes, A Comprehensive Guide to Emergency Planning, Prepping, really, and Crisis Survival. And then, of course, the biggest one, When Technology Fails, A Manual for Self-Reliance, Sustainability, and Surviving the Long Emergency.
Yeah, and if you've got little kids, I've got a great children's story that I always forget to talk about called Geronimo the Frog.
Yeah, why would you write that?
Well, I made the story up for my daughter when she's now 33, and she was about 4 years old, and she just loved it. It was about this frog in the swamps who gets pissed off because there's a bunch of party animals who are throwing all their trash in the swamp, and they're really not respecting it. So there's kind of a back and forth battle between the animals in the swamp and these guys who are trashing the swamp. And so it was a lot of fun, and my daughter just loved the story. And then I kept thinking I should write it down, and a few years go by and I never wrote it down. But her friend would come over and spend the night and say, "Dad, tell us Geronimo again," and they'd laugh and scream, and I'd animate the story for them and jump around like a frog and pounce, and they thought it was great. But I never got to writing it down. So then a few years later go by, and I'm on a business trip in Las Vegas where I installed an experimental drinking fountain valve. I was director of engineering for Haas Company and designed a special light touch valve. And the water quality was really terrible in Vegas with lots of dissolved solids and minerals in the water. And so they're cake up on all the pipes and valves. So it was a great kind of torture test. So I installed these valves there for a year, was down there servicing them and looking at them and, troubleshooting and seeing how my new design did. And I go to sleep, and I get yanked out of sleep about 1 a.m. with this voice in my head going, "Stop procrastinating. Write it down now." It meaning Geronimo the Frog. And it's like, well, I'm wide awake in the middle of the night, and I got work to do the next day, and I can't sleep. So I get my yellow pad out, and I wrote the first draft to Geronimo the Frog. And then finally, it's like, "Can I go to sleep now?" And the little, voice of spirit in my head says, yeah, you finally wrote it down. It's okay. So I go back to sleep, catch a couple hours of sleep, get up, do my work. And I'm sitting in the airport, and I'm wondering, how the hell am I going to find the names for these animals in the book? I knew I wanted Native American names, and I didn't even know the name of the tribe in Florida, much less how I would find the Native American names for them. And I'm just kind of wondering about this while I'm sitting there, get on the airplane. So I board my plane, and I sit down. There's an empty seat beside me, and this lady comes walking down the aisle, just older lady, silver-haired lady with just incredible Native American jewelry just all over her, necklace, rings, bracelet, just like the most amazing Native American jewelry I'd ever seen. And she sits down in the seat right beside me. So we're chatting, and she's got a book on Native American Sign Language. So it turned out that she was a full-blooded Cherokee, born and raised on the res, and she'd had an abusive husband, had children very young, and then divorced, and he was alcoholic. And a affirmative action program, helped her to go back to school, and she eventually got her PhD and was a college professor. And so I told her about the night before writing this story down and getting yanked out of sleep. And she says, "Well, it's obvious that you should, you're supposed to write this book for a reason." And then I said, "Well, would you happen to know how I might be able to find someone who could provide me Native American names for the Florida animals in this book?" And she said, "Well, I was on the Seminole Reservation in Florida last week, and I'll put you in touch with a couple of elders." And one of those elders provided me with all the names for the animal characters in my book, the Native American names for the animal characters in my book. And so that was just another one of those amazing serendipitous synchronistic events in my lifetime that I've had quite a number of. And here I am sitting in the airport wondering how I'm going to find how I can possibly get these names for my book. And the lady sits down beside me and was on the reservation just the week before, and she was my key to getting those names for the characters in my book.
2 great books and this charming kids book. So for the audience, you can pick up one of these survival books for yourself and pick up a book for the kid.
That's right. You got it.
How can the audience interact with you? Are you on social media or Facebook,
Sure.
Twitter?
Yeah, I've got, you can look up Matt Stein, Matt with 1 T, Stein. And actually, if you go to my websites, whentechfails.com, short for When Technology Fails, or Matt Stein, MATSTEIN.com, then there will be links to Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. So I'm on all 4 of those. And also you can, if you click on Stay Informed, then there's a mailing list that I'm really terrible about. I like almost never send anything out. So don't worry that, I mean, you'll get a lot more posts from me on Facebook. The mailing list, one of these days I'll start using it a little more, but I've got like a MailChimp list. And so on occasion I send out announcements, like if I'm going to be on a big radio show or if I'm going to be presenting at a prepper show somewhere, then or speaking somewhere that, then I'll try to get those out on the mailing list. I certainly post them on Facebook, and on occasion I send out a little newsletter on the mailing list, but I've been really lax on that department.
Matt Stein, extremely educational. Great show.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being on, and I will say also on whentechfails.com under art, there's a lot of like really good practical articles, especially in the survival section. Building the Ultimate Survival Kit has a lot of live links to purchasing quality gear that I've tried and used myself, and it's good stuff. And I'm not, the only thing I sell directly on my websites is my books. Everything else is just links to somewhere else. I get a modest associate's fee on some of the links that basically just covers the cost of me having a website. I don't actually make any money on it. So, and the books are, if I lived off of my books, I would have starved ages ago. So it's not like you're feeding a greedy author who's making millions of dollars. That ain't me.
No, I know how these books are, and people, if they think that you guys are getting rich, they're under complete misapprehension. It doesn't work that way at all.
Well, especially since my first publisher was on the verge of bankruptcy and never paid me. So I borrowed against my house, and then I racked up credit cards writing the book and never paid me, and I had to hire a lawyer and a CPA and spend another $10,000 just to get my own book back. So at one point I was down, I thought, somewhere a little less than $250,000 in the hole. So it took me a long time to break even, like 10 years of working on it, and I finally broke even.
The book is awesome. I'm vouching for it. That's it. Matthew Stein, thank you so much for being a guest on the program.
Oh, well, you're most welcome. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and good luck. Happy prepping. I like my iPhone. I like being able to go to Costco and the gas station. I hope the world doesn't fall apart tomorrow. But I'm also worried that somewhere out there in the not too distant future, for one of the multiple reasons, we're going to have a really long down period where if you're not ready, it's going to be really, really rough. Even if you're ready, it'll be rough. But if you're not ready, it'll be horrible. On that light note, I leave you.